There's a specific kind of haunting that happens to avoidant men after they've left a super empath, one that looks nothing like ordinary breakup grief, one they'll spend years trying to name without ever quite managing to find the right words for it. Because the strange truth is, avoidant men leave relationships all the time. They're often, in fact, remarkably good at it. Clean exits, minimal drama, a genuine capacity to compartmentalize and move forward that would be impressive if it weren't built on such fragile psychological foundations. Ordinary relationships end, and ordinary avoidant men move through the predictable stages we traced in an earlier conversation. Relief, gradual detachment, eventual redirection toward the next connection. The whole cycle largely intact and functional. This is not what happens after a relationship with a super empath ends. Something different occurs, something considerably more persistent, something that follows an avoidant man in ways he genuinely struggles to explain, even to himself, sometimes for years after the relationship has definitively concluded. Today, we're going to understand exactly why this specific bond proves so uniquely difficult for avoidant psychology to release, and why understanding this mechanism matters, both for anyone currently living inside this exact dynamic and for anyone trying to make sense of why an avoidant ex seems permanently, inexplicably unable to fully move on. Let's start with something crucial to understand about what actually makes a super empath's presence so different from what most avoidant men encounter throughout the rest of their relational history. Remember what we've established across multiple previous conversations about how avoidant attachment fundamentally operates. His nervous system was trained early and thoroughly to associate closeness with threat, which means his relational history typically consists of a predictable, manageable pattern. Partners who either pursue him with increasing anxiety, activating his withdrawal instinct, or partners who match his distance defensively, producing relationships that never develop enough genuine intimacy to feel threatening in the first place. Both patterns, however painful, remain fundamentally familiar to his psychological architecture. They fit within categories he's encountered before, categories his defensive system knows how to process and eventually resolve. A super empath breaks this pattern completely, and we examined exactly why in a previous conversation about the specific empath type who brings avoidance to their knees. She doesn't pursue with anxious need, which means his usual withdrawal instinct finds nothing to activate against. She doesn't match his distance defensively either, because her own emotional stability was never actually contingent on his engagement in the first place. What she offers instead is something his psychological architecture has almost no practiced framework for processing: genuine warmth, genuine presence, genuine depth of connection, offered without any of the anxious dependency his defenses were specifically built to detect and retreat from. This is the first crucial piece of understanding why this specific bond proves so difficult to release, and it's worth examining carefully, because it explains something that confuses so many people trying to understand avoidant psychology from the outside: why an avoidant man might leave a relationship that was, by almost any external measure, genuinely good for him. Because here's what actually happens during a relationship with a super empath, something we traced in detail previously. Her presence eventually forces a confrontation with his own genuine capacity for connection, one his defensive architecture worked very hard to keep him from ever having to face directly. This confrontation, however genuinely valuable it might be for his eventual growth, often produces exactly the kind of overwhelming vulnerability his nervous system was trained to escape from immediately and completely. This is precisely why avoidant men so often end relationships with super empaths at exactly the moment things are going remarkably well. A pattern that appears deeply self-destructive from the outside, but that makes complete sense once you understand the underlying mechanism. He's not leaving because something is wrong. He's leaving because something is, for the first time in his adult life, genuinely, terrifyingly right. And his nervous system has no established protocol for tolerating this specific quality of closeness without eventually needing to escape it. Here's where the real difference begins, though. The piece that separates this specific ending from every other relationship's conclusion, he's successfully processed and moved past throughout his life. Because in most of his previous relationships, once he's created distance, that distance tends to resolve his internal discomfort relatively completely. The relief we discussed in our conversation about avoidant psychology and delayed grief typically settles in and remains settled, at least for a meaningful stretch of time, precisely because the relationship never actually activated genuine deep vulnerability significant enough to leave lasting psychological residue once it ended. A super empath's presence, precisely because it briefly, genuinely accessed his authentic capacity for connection before he retreated from it, leaves something behind that ordinary relationships simply don't. Remember what we discussed about the specific quality of memory intrusion that follows genuine loss, the way certain moments resurface unbidden, carrying emotional weight that resists conscious suppression. With a super empath specifically, these intrusions tend to be considerably more vivid, considerably more persistent, precisely because what they're actually recalling isn't simply pleasant memory. It's the specific rare experience of his own defenses briefly, genuinely dissolving, allowing him access to a version of himself capable of real intimacy, a version he's spent his entire adult life successfully avoiding encountering with almost anyone else. This is the crucial distinction worth understanding. He's not simply missing her the way he might miss any meaningful ex-partner. He's missing access to a version of himself that only seemed to exist in her specific presence, a version his defensive architecture has genuinely no other reliable method of accessing again, because it required her particular combination of warmth without need, presence without pressure, closeness without the anxious dependency his nervous system was specifically trained to detect and escape. Let's talk about what this actually means for how the bond persists over time, because understanding this reveals something crucial about why getting over a super empath proves so genuinely different from processing the end of an ordinary relationship, even years after the actual separation has occurred. Here's the mechanism worth understanding in detail. For most relationship endings, avoidant psychology relies heavily on what we might call substitutable resolution. The specific person becomes less important over time than the general function they provided, which means a new relationship, offering roughly similar functions, can eventually produce enough satisfaction to make the original loss feel genuinely resolved. This is precisely why avoidant men often move into new relationships relatively quickly following most breakups, and why these new relationships, while perhaps not identical to what came before, manage to provide sufficient stabilization that the previous relationship gradually fades into unremarkable memory rather than persistent, unresolved longing. A super empath's specific quality of presence resists this substitution mechanism in a way that genuinely distinguishes her from almost everyone else in his relational history. Because what she offered wasn't simply a general function. Companionship, validation, physical intimacy, the various things any reasonably compatible partner might provide. She offered something considerably more specific and considerably harder to replicate, the exact combination of psychological safety that allowed his authentic self to briefly, genuinely emerge from behind decades of defensive architecture. This isn't a function easily provided by whoever comes next, because it doesn't primarily depend on the new partner's qualities at all. It depends on a very particular kind of presence, one that requires exactly the combination of genuine wholeness, genuine lack of anxious need, and genuine depth of authentic warmth that made the original Super Empath so uniquely disarming in the first place. This is why new relationships following a Super Empath so often fail to produce the same satisfaction, regardless of how objectively compatible or genuinely wonderful the new partner might be. He's not comparing her specific personality traits, her appearance, her particular interests, or qualities to whoever comes next. He's comparing the specific psychological experience of being fully, safely seen without threat, an experience that proves remarkably difficult to replicate, precisely because it required something rare and specific, rather than something any reasonably loving partner could theoretically provide. Here's what makes this bond even more persistent, something worth understanding, because it explains a pattern many super empaths report confusingly encountering years after a relationship's ending. Avoidant men who left them sometimes resurface, sometimes repeatedly, across genuinely significant spans of time, in ways that don't follow the typical pattern of an ex simply moving on and occasionally, briefly, reconnecting out of casual curiosity or nostalgia. Remember what we discussed extensively about avoidant psychology and delayed grief, the way genuine reckoning with loss often arrives considerably later than it would for someone with healthier attachment patterns, precisely because the deferral mechanism requires the fantasy of eventual return to remain available in order to function. With a super empath specifically, this deferral mechanism operates somewhat differently than it does in more ordinary relationships, because what he's actually deferring isn't simply reconciliation with a specific person. He's deferring reconciliation with his own genuine capacity for connection, something he associates specifically and powerfully with her presence, which means the fantasy of eventual return often persists considerably longer, resurfacing at unexpected intervals across years rather than resolving within the more typical time frame we've discussed for ordinary relationship endings. This explains something that genuinely confuses many super empaths who've experienced this specific pattern. An avoidant ex who reaches out, sometimes years after the relationship ended, sometimes after his own significant personal growth, sometimes even after building an entirely new life that appears, from the outside, genuinely stable and moved on. This resurfacing isn't necessarily evidence of ongoing, unprocessed obsession in the way it might initially appear. It's often evidence of something more specific, a genuine, persistent association between her presence and his own authentic self, one that continues surfacing precisely because he's never found an adequate substitute for what her particular quality of presence made possible inside him. Here's something crucial to understand about why this specific pattern matters so much for anyone currently living inside it. Whether as the super empath processing an avoidant ex's periodic resurfacing, or as someone trying to understand why this particular kind of bond seems to resist the usual resolution timeline. This persistent association doesn't actually mean reconciliation would work if it eventually occurred, and this distinction matters enormously because it's easy to interpret the depth and persistence of this bond as evidence that genuine reunion, if it ever happened, would finally succeed where the original relationship failed. This interpretation misunderstands something crucial about what actually happened during the original relationship and about what would need to be genuinely different for reconciliation to actually succeed, rather than simply repeat the same underlying pattern. Remember what we established about why he originally left, at exactly the moment things were going well. Not because anything external went wrong, but because his own nervous system encountered genuine intimacy, significant enough to trigger exactly the escape response his psychology was built to produce. Nothing about the passage of time, nothing about his own periodic resurfacing, nothing about the persistent memory intrusions we've discussed automatically resolves this underlying pattern. Without genuine sustained work specifically addressing his attachment wound, the same dynamic that produced the original departure remains fully intact, waiting to reactivate the moment genuine intimacy once again reaches the same threshold that triggered his withdrawal before. This is precisely why understanding this entire mechanism matters so much, not as validation that reconciliation would finally work if given another chance, but as genuine, accurate insight into why this specific bond feels so different from ordinary relationship loss, without that difference automatically translating into evidence that a different outcome awaits if the relationship were simply attempted again. Because here's what this understanding actually needs to lead toward. And it's worth being direct about this rather than leaving the conversation suspended in fascinating psychological mechanism without ever addressing what it means for how you actually live your life afterward. Whether you're the super empath who was left, or someone trying to understand why an avoidant ex won't seem to fully let go. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that this persistent bond, however genuine, however psychologically significant, was never actually evidence that you did something wrong, or that you should have somehow managed his attachment wound more skillfully in order to prevent his departure. Remember what we established about why he left at exactly the moment things were going well. This wasn't a response to any failure on your part. It was his own nervous system encountering genuine intimacy at a depth it had no established capacity to tolerate, regardless of how perfectly, how patiently, how genuinely you showed up throughout the relationship. No amount of additional patience, additional understanding, or additional adjustment on your part would have prevented this specific outcome, because the trigger was never actually located in anything you did. It was located entirely in his own unresolved attachment history, something that existed and would have eventually activated regardless of which partner happened to access it. The second thing worth understanding involves what actually protects you from the specific trap this persistent bond can create, especially if he does eventually resurface, sometimes years later, carrying what might genuinely be authentic longing and authentic recognition of what he lost. Because here's the crucial distinction worth holding on to clearly. His genuine longing for the version of himself that existed in your presence is not the same thing as genuine, developed capacity to sustain that version of himself across an actual, ongoing relationship. Longing for something and having built the internal architecture required to actually hold it long term are two entirely different achievements, and conflating them is precisely what leads so many super empaths back into repeated cycles with avoidant exes, whose returns feel genuine and significant, but whose underlying capacity for sustained intimacy remains fundamentally unchanged from what originally produced the departure. This means that if he does resurface, whether once or repeatedly, whether with obvious genuine emotion or with something more subtle and harder to name, the question worth asking isn't whether his feelings seem real. They likely are. The question worth asking is whether anything has actually demonstrably changed in his capacity to tolerate exactly the depth of intimacy that triggered his original withdrawal. Evidence of sustained therapeutic work, evidence of genuine behavioral change tested across real circumstances rather than simply articulated as intention, evidence that goes considerably beyond words spoken in a moment of genuine but potentially temporary reconnection with his own longing. The third and final thing worth understanding, the one that ultimately matters most regardless of what he eventually does or doesn't do with his own unresolved history, is this. Your own wholeness was never actually dependent on his capacity to fully release or fully return to this bond. The specific quality of presence that made you so uniquely significant to him, the warmth without need, the depth without anxious dependency, the genuine wholeness that doesn't require his engagement in order to remain completely intact, That quality exists independent of him entirely. It's not something his memory of you validates or completes. It's something you already fully possess, regardless of whether he ever finds his way back to acknowledging what he encountered in your presence, and regardless of whether that acknowledgement, if it ever comes, arrives paired with the genuine capacity to actually build something lasting from it. This is ultimately why avoidance can't escape the bond with a super empath, and why understanding this mechanism should function as clarity rather than false hope. He encountered, however briefly, an authentic version of himself he's spent his entire life avoiding, made possible specifically by a quality of presence that doesn't simply appear whenever he wants it to, because it was never actually his to summon in the first place. It was always yours, and it remains yours, complete and intact, whether he ever finds his way back to it or spends the rest of his life simply, quietly, missing something he was never quite brave enough to fully receive while he actually had it. Thanks for watch. Don't forget to give your feedback in comment section, and please subscribe for more stuff.